Say her name. Alexis Hill. Say her name.
Topping our news, the manager of a Columbus Dollar General store is dead tonight after police say a customer shot her after a small purchase, then later opened fire on police at a separate scene.
That would lead to an officer-involved shooting that left the suspect dead and a police officer and K-9 officer injured. Police reporting tonight that the officer has been treated and is expected to make a full recovery, while the K-9 is still being treated.
There are some tragedies that leave behind a reason. Others leave behind only silence. Long after the flashing lights disappear and the headlines fade, the same question continues to echo through the lives of everyone left behind. How could something so ordinary end this way? Inside a neighborhood store, the day unfolded like countless others before it. Familiar faces came and went. Small conversations filled the aisles. Cash registers opened and closed. Nothing about those first moments suggested that within minutes an entire community would be forced to confront a reality it could neither predict nor understand. For the people who were there, the memory would never be measured by hours but by seconds. They would replay those moments repeatedly, searching for an explanation hidden somewhere between routine and tragedy. Investigators would later examine every available detail, hoping to answer the same questions that witnesses and loved ones could not. As news spread across Columbus, the loss reached far beyond the walls of a single business. Family members struggled to understand how someone they expected to see again that evening would never return home. Friends searched for words that could explain the unexplainable. Even experienced investigators found themselves piecing together a sequence of events that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. What followed would become far more than the investigation of a single crime. It would raise difficult questions about choices, accountability, public safety, and whether the warning signs, if any existed, had been missed long before that morning ever began. Over the days that followed, detectives reconstructed every known movement, interviewed witnesses, reviewed surveillance footage, and followed every lead available to them. Piece by piece, a timeline began to emerge. Yet every answer uncovered seemed to reveal another question waiting beneath it. The truth would eventually become clearer through evidence, official findings, and the voices of those forever changed by what happened. But before investigators knew who they were looking for or why this ordinary morning had taken such an unexpected turn, there was only one question that everyone wanted answered. What really happened inside that Dollar General store on the morning of the 23rd of June 2026? Viewer discretion is advised. This documentary examines a real criminal case involving the loss of life. Some of the events discussed may be upsetting for some viewers, although we will present them with accuracy, respect, and without unnecessary graphic detail. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Please consider subscribing for carefully researched true crime documentaries that separate fact from speculation, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. To everyone who continues to support this channel through your views, likes, thoughtful comments, and shares, thank you. Your support helps keep these real stories remembered and allows us to continue producing in-depth documentaries based on verified information. Before her name appeared in news reports across Georgia, Alexis Hill was simply known as Alexis to the people who loved her. At 44 years old, she had built a life centered on responsibility, family, and hard work. Friends and relatives described her as dependable. The kind of person who showed up when she said she would and who could be counted on when someone needed help. Whether it was family, work, or everyday responsibilities, Alexis approached each with the same steady commitment. She was a devoted mother to 3 sons and a proud grandmother of 2 young grandchildren. According to her family, those roles meant more to her than any job title. She stayed closely involved in their lives, celebrated their milestones, and looked forward to spending as much time with them as possible. Those closest to her remembered a woman who found genuine happiness in seeing her family grow. Professionally, Alexis had earned the trust of both her employer and the people she worked alongside. As the manager of the Dollar General store on Victory Drive in Columbus, she was responsible for overseeing daily operations, supporting her employees, and helping customers. Retail management often demands long hours, quick decisions, and constant problem solving, but coworkers said Alexis handled those responsibilities with patience and professionalism. Customers came to recognize her as a familiar face. Many visited the store regularly and knew her as someone who greeted people with courtesy and treated everyone with respect. To the community she served each day, she was more than a store manager. She had become part of their routine. Her family also spoke about the future she was planning. Alexis had been preparing for a move to Colorado, where she hoped to be closer to relatives and begin a new chapter of her life. It was a decision she looked forward to, seeing it as an opportunity to spend more time with the people who mattered most while embracing a fresh start. Those who knew Alexis have consistently remembered her for the way she lived rather than the way her life ended. They described a woman whose character was defined by kindness, resilience, and a willingness to put others first. Long before this case drew national attention, she had already made a lasting impression on the people fortunate enough to know her, not through extraordinary circumstances, but through the quiet consistency of the life she chose to live. As investigators later examined the timeline, one detail became immediately apparent. There was no publicly documented history connecting Alexis Hill to the man who would eventually become the focus of the investigation. Authorities have never indicated that the two knew one another before the 23rd of June, 2026. There were no verified reports of previous encounters, ongoing disputes, workplace conflicts, or personal disagreements linking Alexis to the suspect. Instead, the available evidence suggested that their paths had not crossed before that morning. In the days leading up to the incident, Alexis continued with the routine that had defined much of her working life. She reported to the Dollar General on Victory Drive, managed daily store operations, worked alongside her employees, and served customers as she normally would. Friends and relatives who later spoke publicly did not describe unusual behavior, expressions of fear, or concerns that she believed she was facing an immediate threat. Investigators also found no verified evidence that the case was preceded by a financial dispute, a domestic conflict, or a personal disagreement involving Alexis. Unlike many homicide investigations in which detectives first examine existing relationships, this case presented a very different challenge from the outset. That distinction would become significant. Without an established relationship between the victim and the suspect, investigators would eventually have to determine whether the events of June 23 were connected to a spontaneous encounter, a misunderstanding, or another motive supported by evidence. For Alexis, however, Tuesday was expected to be another normal workday. The store was scheduled to open as usual. Employees prepared for another day of assisting customers, stocking shelves, and managing the steady flow of business that came with a neighborhood retail store. Nothing in the verified timeline suggested that the morning would unfold differently from countless others that had come before. Within a few hours, that routine would be interrupted by an incident that would leave investigators searching for answers from the very first moments of their inquiry. On Tuesday, the 23rd of June, 2026, Columbus, Georgia, the Dollar General store on Victory Drive had opened for business, and the morning was unfolding as expected. Employees moved between their assigned tasks while customers stopped in to purchase everyday necessities. It was the kind of routine that repeated itself day after day, with little reason to believe this Tuesday would be remembered any differently. Among the employees working that morning was store manager Alexis Hill As manager, she was responsible for overseeing operations, assisting customers, and supporting her staff throughout the shift. Like every other workday, her focus was on keeping the store running smoothly. Later that morning, a customer entered the store and selected a small number of items for purchase. According to investigators, the transaction led to a disagreement involving $1.58 in change. While disagreements between customers and retail employees are not uncommon, authorities said this interaction escalated far beyond what anyone inside the store could have anticipated. Within moments, what had begun as a routine transaction turned into a critical emergency. Employees and customers who were inside the store were forced to react quickly as the situation unfolded. Several witnesses would later provide statements describing the sequence of events they observed, while others immediately contacted emergency services to report what had happened. Dispatchers received multiple 911 calls, prompting officers with the Columbus Police Department and emergency medical personnel to respond to the Dollar General without delay. When officers arrived, their first priority was securing the scene and ensuring there was no continuing threat to the public. Emergency responders attended to those involved while officers began separating witnesses, preserving the scene, and documenting the circumstances exactly as they found them. The store, which only minutes earlier had been operating as any neighborhood business would, was now at the center of an active homicide investigation. As detectives were notified, officers worked to establish a preliminary timeline. They identified witnesses, located surveillance cameras that might have captured the incident, and began preserving physical evidence before the scene could be disturbed. Every observation, every statement, and every minute of the timeline would become important. Investigators also moved quickly to identify the individual believed to have left the scene. Information gathered during those first critical hours would guide the next phase of the case and determine where the investigation would lead. By the time the initial response was complete, one fact was already clear. What had happened inside the Dollar General that morning could not be understood through assumptions alone. It would require careful analysis, verified evidence, and a meticulous reconstruction of every event. The investigation had begun. With the Dollar General store secured, the focus shifted from emergency response to evidence. Every minute after the initial call became part of a carefully coordinated investigation. Detectives from the Columbus Police Department began documenting the scene exactly as they found it, knowing that even the smallest detail could prove significant once witness statements and physical evidence were compared. The first objective was straightforward: establish an accurate timeline. Investigators identified every employee and customer who had been inside the store during the incident. Each witness was interviewed separately while events were still fresh in their memory. Rather than relying on a single account, detectives looked for points where independent statements matched. Those overlapping details would become the foundation of the official timeline. Surveillance footage quickly became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Investigators secured video from inside the Dollar General, allowing them to compare witness recollections with what the cameras had recorded. The footage helped confirm the sequence of events inside the store and provided investigators with a clearer understanding of how the encounter unfolded. According to authorities, the evidence supported witness accounts that the confrontation developed during a customer transaction before escalating within moments. Detectives also documented the checkout area where the incident occurred. Transaction records were preserved alongside surveillance evidence so investigators could accurately reconstruct what had taken place immediately before the violence began. Those records helped establish the timing of the purchase and place the encounter within a precise investigative timeline. Another critical question demanded an immediate answer. Did the victim and the suspect know one another? Investigators explored that possibility early in the case because prior relationships often provide context in homicide investigations. In this case, however, authorities publicly stated they found no evidence that Alexis Hill and Jerome Willis had any known prior connection. Family members also said the two were complete strangers. That finding significantly shaped the direction of the investigation, suggesting detectives were not dealing with a long-running personal dispute, but with an encounter that appeared to develop inside the store itself. While crime scene investigators continued processing evidence inside the Dollar General, another team focused on locating the suspect. Using information gathered during the initial response, officers quickly developed leads on his whereabouts. Time was critical. Detectives understood that locating the suspect could not only prevent additional harm, but also preserve evidence that might otherwise be lost. Roughly an hour after the incident, officers located Jerome Willis near Baker Plaza Drive. According to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, officers issued verbal commands in an effort to take him into custody. When he failed to comply, a K-9 unit was deployed. Authorities say Willis then opened fire, injuring both a Columbus police officer and K-9 Havoc. Officers returned fire, and Willis died at the scene. Because law enforcement officers discharged their weapons, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation assumed responsibility for reviewing that separate officer-involved shooting, following standard procedure in Georgia. With the suspect no longer alive, investigators faced a different challenge. There would be no custodial interview, no opportunity to question him about his actions, and no direct explanation from the person at the center of the case. From that point forward, the investigation would depend almost entirely on physical evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony, official records, and forensic analysis rather than a confession or interview. Authorities have not publicly released extensive forensic findings such as DNA analysis, fingerprint comparisons, phone data, GPS records, or search warrant affidavits connected to this case. As a result, investigators have not attributed the outcome to any single piece of forensic evidence. Instead, the publicly available record shows that the reconstruction relied primarily on the crime scene, surveillance video, witness statements, transaction records, and the events that followed as officers located the suspect. Cases are sometimes remembered for a single headline. Investigators, however, remember them by the evidence. For detectives, the timeline inside the Dollar General was no longer a collection of separate moments. It had become a verified sequence, supported by witnesses, surveillance, and physical evidence. But one question still remained unanswered. Why had a routine purchase escalated into an act that would forever change so many lives? By the end of the first day, investigators had identified the man at the center of the case as Jerome Willis, a 32-year-old Columbus resident. Unlike many homicide investigations, detectives would never have the opportunity to question him directly. The encounter with law enforcement shortly after the incident meant investigators had to reconstruct his actions through evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and official records rather than a custodial interview. As investigators examined his background, they searched for anything that might explain why the events of June 23 unfolded the way they did. They looked for evidence of a prior relationship with Alexis Hill, previous contact with the Dollar General store, or any documented conflict that could establish a motive. None was found. According to investigators and statements from Alexis Hill's family, there was no known connection between the two. They were strangers whose paths crossed for the first and only time inside the store that morning. That finding immediately distinguished this case from many relationship or family-related homicide investigations, where detectives often begin by examining personal histories, domestic disputes, or long-standing conflicts. Here, investigators found no verified evidence that Alexis had ever met Jerome Willis before the encounter that led to the tragedy. Authorities have also been careful not to publicly speculate about motive beyond the evidence they collected. While early reports indicated that the confrontation began during a customer transaction involving a dispute over change, investigators have not released information suggesting a broader personal motive or a premeditated plan targeting Alexis Hill specifically. As a result, many of the questions surrounding Willis's state of mind remain unanswered in the public record. Investigators also reviewed his actions after leaving the Dollar General. The timeline established by law enforcement showed that officers moved quickly once they identified him as the suspect. Their efforts to locate him led to Baker Plaza Drive, where they attempted to take him into custody. According to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, officers issued commands instructing Willis to surrender peacefully. Authorities said he did not comply. During the encounter, a Columbus Police Department K-9 was deployed in an effort to assist with the arrest. Investigators say Willis then fired at responding officers, injuring one officer in K-9 havoc. Officers returned fire and Willis died at the scene. Because law enforcement officers discharged their weapons, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation assumed responsibility for reviewing that officer-involved shooting, following standard procedure under Georgia law. That review was conducted separately from the homicide investigation involving Alexis Hill. With Willis deceased, detectives were left with a case that would never include a courtroom testimony, a police interview, or an explanation from the person accused of carrying out the crime. Many questions that investigators routinely ask suspects would never receive direct answers. Instead, the evidence itself became the primary witness. Every conclusion reached by investigators had to be supported by surveillance footage, physical evidence, transaction records, witness interviews, and the documented timeline established during the investigation. That evidence allowed detectives to reconstruct what happened, but it could not fully explain why it happened. For Alexis Hill's family, the absence of those answers only deepened the tragedy. They were left not only grieving the loss of someone they loved, but also facing questions that may never be answered with complete certainty. As the investigation drew to a close, attention turned from identifying the suspect to determining how the case would be formally concluded under the law. With Jerome Willis dead, the criminal case against him effectively came to an end before it could enter the courtroom. There would be no indictment, no trial, no jury, and no opportunity for prosecutors to present the evidence before a judge. Instead, investigators focused on completing the homicide investigation and documenting the events as thoroughly as possible so that the official record reflected exactly what had occurred. Although the homicide investigation was nearing its conclusion, another investigation was just beginning. Because Columbus police officers had discharged their firearms during the encounter with Willis, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation assumed responsibility for examining the officer-involved shooting. Under Georgia law, this is standard procedure whenever law enforcement uses deadly force. The purpose is to provide an independent review of the circumstances surrounding the officer's actions. The GBI's role was separate from the homicide investigation involving Alexis Hill. Its investigators gathered evidence from the location where Willis was found, interviewed the officers involved, documented the scene, and collected physical evidence to determine whether the use of force was legally justified under the circumstances. Once completed, those findings would be submitted to the appropriate prosecuting authority for review following Georgia's established legal process. Meanwhile, the Columbus Police Department continued finalizing the homicide case through the evidence already collected. Surveillance footage, witness interviews, transaction records, and the physical evidence recovered from the Dollar General formed the foundation of the investigative file. Together, those materials allowed detectives to reconstruct the events of June 23 with a high degree of confidence, even without a suspect interview or future court proceedings. For Alexis Hill's family, however, the legal process could never provide the kind of closure that comes from hearing questions answered in court. There would be no testimony explaining the decisions made that morning. No cross-examination, no sentencing hearing. Many of the questions surrounding motive would remain unanswered because the only person capable of fully explaining his actions was no longer alive. In many criminal cases, a trial becomes the final chapter of the investigation. This case was different. The official findings established what investigators believed had happened based on the available evidence, but the legal system was never given the opportunity to test that evidence in open court through the adversarial process. Even so, the investigation produced a clear factual record, one built on witness testimony, surveillance footage, physical evidence, and official documentation, rather than speculation. For the justice system, the case had reached its legal conclusion. For Alexis Hill's family and the Columbus community, the journey toward healing was only beginning. When the investigation ended, the headlines gradually began to fade. For Alexis Hill's family, however, life would never return to what it had been before June 23. The woman they knew as a devoted mother, grandmother, sister, and friend was no longer coming home. While investigators had answered many of the factual questions surrounding the case, they could not fill the space her absence left behind. In the days that followed, family members publicly remembered Alexis not for the tragedy that claimed her life, but for the way she had lived it. They described someone who consistently put the needs of others ahead of her own. Whether she was spending time with her children and grandchildren, supporting relatives through difficult moments, or helping those around her at work, they said she was the kind of person people naturally depended on. Those closest to her also spoke about the future she had been preparing for. Plans that once represented a new beginning had suddenly become painful reminders of a life interrupted far too soon. Her coworkers at the Dollar General store were also left trying to process what had happened. For many, Alexis had been more than a manager. She was the person who helped train new employees, solve problems during busy shifts, and created an environment where people felt respected. Customers who visited the store regularly remembered her as someone who greeted people with kindness and professionalism, often making an ordinary shopping trip feel a little more welcoming. As news of the case spread, members of the Columbus community gathered to honor her memory. Flowers, balloons, handwritten notes, and candles were placed near the store where she had worked. Friends, neighbors, customers, and people who had never met Alexis stopped to pay their respects, reflecting on how quickly an ordinary morning had become a tragedy that affected an entire community. Many of those tributes carried the same message. Retail employees deserve to feel safe while doing their jobs. Across social media, countless people shared their own experiences of working in customer service, describing the challenges that frontline employees often face while simply trying to earn a living. Alexis's death became part of a broader conversation about the respect and dignity owed to workers who interact with the public every day. For her family, that public support brought comfort, even if it could never erase their grief. They expressed gratitude to everyone who reached out with prayers, messages of encouragement, and acts of kindness during an unimaginably difficult time. Their focus remained on remembering Alexis for the person she had always been, rather than allowing the circumstances of her death to define her legacy. Today, that is how many people in Columbus continue to remember her. Not as a headline, not as a case number, but as a woman who loved her family, worked hard, treated people with respect, and left behind memories that continue to live on through everyone fortunate enough to know her. Long after the investigation was completed and the news cameras disappeared, those memories remained And for the people who loved Alexis Hill, they always will. Some cases are remembered because of their complexity. Others are remembered because they force us to confront how quickly an ordinary day can change forever. The death of Alexis Hill is one of those cases. What began as a routine morning at a neighborhood Dollar General became a tragedy that left a family grieving, co-workers searching for answers, and an entire community reflecting on the value of patience, respect, and compassion in everyday life. Throughout this documentary, we followed the evidence as it was presented by investigators, separated verified facts from speculation, and focused on the people whose lives were forever changed. Even after the investigation concluded, one reality remained unchanged. No report, legal finding, or official statement could restore what Alexis's loved ones had lost. Cases like this also remind us why facts matter. In the hours and days after a major crime, rumors often spread faster than verified information. But understanding what truly happened requires patience, careful investigation, and a willingness to let the evidence, not assumptions, tell the story. That's why it's so important to distinguish between what is known, what was confirmed by investigators, and what may never be fully explained. For Alexis Hill's family, the hope has always been that she will be remembered for the life she lived rather than the circumstances of her death. Those who knew her have consistently described a woman who cared deeply for her family, worked hard, and treated others with kindness. That is the legacy they continue to protect. Thank you for spending this time with us and for helping keep Alexis's story alive through respectful conversation and awareness. If you appreciate true crime documentaries that prioritize verified facts, thoughtful storytelling, and respect for victims over sensationalism, consider subscribing. Every subscription, every thoughtful comment, and every share helps us continue producing carefully researched documentaries that honor the people behind the headlines and encourage informed discussion about cases that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and wherever you are in the world, take care of yourselves and take care of one another.